Hey, it's Dr. P, your communication coach. People ask me all the time, what do you mean by shame-free communicator? One of the ways that we can tell when we're using shame to communicate with other people is when we use loaded questions. A loaded question is something like, what were you thinking? When we think about the question, what were you thinking? We're not actually asking a question, right? We are making a statement, and the statement is usually, you're an idiot. At least when someone asks us a loaded question, that's usually what we hear. And that's why when someone asks a loaded question, we typically respond by either asking them another loaded question, throwing it right back at them, or responding in another defensive way, or we might shut down completely. But what loaded questions do is they sabotage the trust in the relationship. There's a little bit of a tinge of shame in there, and it makes us not really trust that other person. So if we want to have great relationships, my communication tip for you today is to turn your loaded questions into a curious question instead. That's an actual question that is meant to try to really understand where that other person is coming from. So a question like, what were you thinking? If we were to turn that into a curious question, we could say something like, can you help me understand what was going on in your mind when you made that particular decision? I realize it takes a lot more energy and there's a lot more words in there, but it's going to really build the trust in your relationship if you're able to learn how to turn that loaded question that you're thinking in your head into a curious question. A lot of our loaded questions start with the word why, like, why are you doing that? Instead, we could ask a truly curious question to understand why they are doing what they're doing. Because if we ask, why are you doing that? They realize we're not actually asking why they're doing that. We're making a statement, you're an idiot. So instead, let's ask a question that will help them process why they're doing what they're doing. So a question like, can you help me understand what you're doing right now? Can you help me understand your thinking around this? So often it has to do with our tone. Can you help me understand what you're trying to accomplish? Can you help me understand your thought process around this? If you can figure out how to change your loaded question with that bite of shame into a truly curious question that says, I really do want to understand, it will change the tone of your relationship. Loaded questions are a habit that we've gotten into, and we have to establish a new habit of asking curious questions instead. They have absolutely revolutionized my relationships. I was on the phone a while back with someone, and that conversation was going nowhere fast. We were headed to a really bad place. Our voices were getting louder. Our tone was getting more critical and blaming and shaming. Something needed to change in that moment for the conversation to result in a different place and us to be able to establish trust between us. In that moment, the loaded question in my head was, why did you do that? That's what I was thinking, and that's what I wanted to say. But I stopped myself. And instead, I thought, how can I turn this into a curious question? So instead, I said, can you help me understand in that moment, what were some of the factors that led you to make the decision you made? And oh my goodness, you would not even believe the difference in the direction the conversation went, because I could almost hear the brain chemistry going on. A loaded question is going to trigger our amygdala, that fear center that sends the stress hormones to the processing center, or thinking brain right here in the front, and just flood it so we can't even think anymore. But when we ask a curious question, we're triggering the processing center to actually think. So instead of asking, why did you do that? Which would have triggered this person's amygdala and just shut them down or made them be super defensive or throw it back at me, this person stopped and said, when I think back, the reasons why I did what I did were because of this and this and this. And it was a really cool conversation because then I was able to respond with empathy and say, yeah, I can imagine how that would have been the case for you at that time. It changed the tone of the conversation because in that moment, I chose to turn a loaded question into a curious question. And that is your communication tip for this week. My challenge for you is when you have a loaded question that you're thinking in your mind, turn it around, ask a curious question, and you'll be amazed at how you can build trust in your relationship and create connection and health by using shame-free communication strategies. Thanks so much for watching. For more communication tips, please subscribe.